She was 8 years old when the world decided it had no more use for her, and the man who made that decision was her mother's own brother. Thaddeus Pruitt stood in the doorway of the farmhouse he had just inherited, looked down at the small girl clutching a carpet bag half her own size, and told her plainly that there was no room in his life, nor his household, nor his heart, for another mouth he had not chosen to feed. She had 11 cents sewn into the hem of her dress, a tin thimble that had belonged to her mother, and nothing else in the world. The town of Hollow Creek, Kansas had no orphanage, no poorhouse, no aunt willing to stretch her table, so the county elders, wringing their hands over what to do with her, settled at last on the only shelter no one else wanted, the abandoned church at the edge of town, its doors swollen shut with damp, its bell tower given over to swallows, its congregation scattered 11 years before by fire and drought and grief. They gave it to her for the price of nothing at all, if you did not count her labor sweeping its floors, and $2 a month from the poor fund to keep her from starving outright. It was, by any sane reckoning, a foolish arrangement, a child alone in a ruined house of God, with no family, no future, and no one checking in on her but a tired sheriff every few weeks. But behind the altar of that forsaken church, sealed inside a compartment no living soul in Hollow Creek remembered was there, lay something that would not merely save her life. It would, in time, save the whole town that had turned its back on her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Iris Calloway. If you have ever lived in a town that the rest of the world forgot and found something worth saving in it anyway, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Iris had been born in the spring of 1870 to Daniel and Ruth Calloway, homesteaders who broke sod on a quarter, section 3 miles outside Hollow Creek, with nothing but a borrowed plow and a stubborn belief that the prairie would eventually reward patience with abundance. Daniel was a quiet man who had learned carpentry from his own father back in Ohio, and he passed the trade to his daughter not through formal lessons but through the simple habit of letting her sit beside him in the tool shed while he worked, naming each tool aloud, showing her how a plane should sing rather than screech across a board, how a joint fit true when you had cut it with care rather than haste. Ruth, for her part, was the kind of woman neighbors sent for when a birth went wrong or a fever would not break, a healer of practical remedies and quiet nerve who taught Iris that a soft word cost nothing and sometimes bought everything. It was Ruth who told her, more than once, that the Lord did not measure a person by what they owned, but by what they were willing to mend. The Calloway farm was never prosperous, not in the way the Pruitt spread 2 sections over was prosperous, with its new barn and its fine horses, but it was warm, and it was honest, and Iris grew up believing that this was simply what a family was. She was 7 when the diphtheria came through the county, riding in on a peddler's wagon the way sickness so often did, indifferent to whose door it knocked upon. It took her baby brother first, then her mother, who wore herself thin nursing half the sick children in the district before the illness found her own throat. Daniel held on through the worst of the winter, working the farm alone with a hollow look in his eyes that Iris, even at 7, understood not to disturb. And then in the following spring, a felled cottonwood he was clearing from the creek bank rolled wrong beneath him, and that was the end of Daniel Calloway too. Iris was 8 years old and entirely alone, and the only kin the county could locate was her mother's brother Thaddeus, a man who had spent the better part of 15 years resenting his sister for marrying beneath what he considered her prospects, and who received the news of his inheritance of the Calloway land with considerably more enthusiasm than he received the news of his orphan niece. He kept the land. He did not keep her. The morning he turned her out, he did not shout or curse. He simply informed her, in the flat tone a man might use to discuss weather, that she would need to make other arrangements, and that he trusted the town would see to it, since it was not his obligation. Iris walked the 3 miles into Hollow Creek carrying her carpet bag and her mother's thimble and the 11 cents that were the entire remainder of the Calloway family fortune, and she did not cry, not because she felt nothing, but because some deep, early formed part of her understood that crying would not put a roof over her head, and a roof was what she needed. It was the church the town gave her, because the church, unlike every other building in Hollow Creek, belonged to no one who might object. The Church of the Blessed Harvest had been built in 1859 by a congregation of hopeful settlers under the guidance of a circuit preacher named Elias Thorne, a man remembered by the old-timers as gentle, learned, and strange in the particular way of men who seemed to carry a private sorrow they never named. The church had thrived for a decade, the heart of a town that believed itself destined to become the county seat, until the drought of 1,869 withered 3 summers of crops in a row, and the Missouri Pacific laid its line 11 miles to the south instead of through Hollow Creek as everyone had assumed it would. The town did not die, but it shrank and shrank again until half its storefronts stood empty and the congregation dwindled to a dozen families who could no longer support a full-time minister. Reverend Thorne left one autumn without much explanation. Some said westward to Colorado, and the church simply closed its doors and was never reopened, its windows going dim with dust, its pews left to warp in the damp that crept up through the floorboards each spring. It was into this hollow, silent building that 8-year-old Iris Calloway carried her carpet bag on a gray October afternoon and stood in the nave looking up at a ceiling hung with cobwebs thick as lace curtains, and understood that this was now, by whatever cruel arithmetic had assigned it to her home. The pews were coated in dust. Birds had nested in the rafters and left their mark on the altar rail. A family of field mice had claimed the vestry as their own small kingdom, but there was a roof, mostly whole, and 4 walls, mostly sound, and a hand pump for water not 50 yards distant. And Iris, who had watched her father repair things all her short life, who had watched her mother make do with less and less, and never once complain of it, set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and began, that very first evening, to sweep. She swept for 3 days before she thought much about the altar at all. It stood at the front of the sanctuary, a simple wooden structure that Reverend Thorne himself was said to have built, plainer than the ornate stone altars of Eastern churches, but solid, with a carved rail of wheat sheaves running along its base, a farming town's tribute to its own hopes. Iris cleaned around it the way she cleaned everything, methodically, the way her father had taught her to work a plane along a board, one clean pass at a time. It was while scrubbing the base of the altar with water carried in a chipped bucket that her fingers found a seam in the wood that did not belong there, a hairline gap, cut with a precision that no accident of settling timber could explain, running along the underside of the altar's rear panel where the wheat sheaf carving gave way to plain board. She was 8 years old, half-starved, entirely alone, and she pressed her thumb into that seam with the same patient curiosity that had made her father's tool shed her favorite room in the world. And after some minutes of careful pressure, the panel gave, swinging inward on a hinge, so old and so well oiled once upon a time that it still, remarkably, moved with only a faint whisper of protest. Inside was a compartment no deeper than a bread box, and inside that compartment, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, was a small tin box, and beside it, folded flat, a single sheet of paper covered in a careful, slanting hand. Iris did not open the tin box that first evening. She was even then a child who understood the weight of things before she understood their meaning, and something in the stillness of that hidden chamber told her this was not a discovery to be rushed. She sat back on her heels in the fading light of the sanctuary and looked at the folded paper for a long while before she finally, gently unfolded it and read, by the last gray light through the dust-caked windows, the opening line, "To whoever finds this, when the time is right and not before, my name is Elias Thorne, and I have wronged this town more than I have served it, though I pray what I leave here may someday set that right." It would take Iris the better part of a decade to understand fully what those words meant, but even at 8, she understood enough to know that she must not speak of it, not to the sheriff, not to the ladies of the county poor fund, not to anyone until she knew more. She refolded the letter, replaced it and the tin box exactly as she had found them, closed the hidden panel until the seam vanished once more into the carved wood, and went on sweeping and waiting, and growing up inside the walls of a church that held a secret she alone in all of Hollow Creek knew existed. The years that followed were not easy ones, though Iris rarely allowed herself to dwell on their hardship, having inherited from her mother a talent for finding small mercies in lean circumstances. She took in mending for the town's few remaining families, her stitches neat and even, taught to her by Ruth's patient hand years before. She grew vegetables in the churchyard where sunlight broke through the elms, using seed saved and traded, and what she did not eat she sold or bartered at the mercantile run by a widower named Silas Krebs, who took a quiet liking to the diligent girl and never once shorted her on a trade, though he could easily have done so. She learned to fix what broke around her, the way her father would have, mending the church's sagging back steps herself with lumber salvaged from a collapsed shed, teaching herself through trial and the memory of her father's hands how a joint should fit, how a nail should be set true rather than driven crooked. By the time she was 14, most of Hollow Creek had half forgotten that the strange, capable girl living alone in the old church had ever been anyone's burden. She had simply become a fixture of the town, quiet and industrious, the kind of person people mentioned in passing Ask Iris. She'll know how to fix it without much thought for the loneliness underneath. She read the tin box's other contents. Only once she turned 12, old enough, she felt to be trusted with whatever truth it held, and what she found inside changed the shape of everything she believed about the town that had cast her aside without ever quite meaning to. Beneath a layer of oilcloth lay a leather ledger, its pages filled with Reverend Thorne's same careful hand, recording not church business, but a private accounting of something else entirely. A survey, dated 1861, of the very land on which half of Hollow Creek now stood, including a notation, underlined twice, that the original town plat, the legal document establishing which parcels belonged to the township for common use and which belonged to individual settlers, had never actually been filed correctly with the territorial land office. Thorne's letter, read fully now, explained the rest in a confession that clearly cost him dearly to write, that in the town's earliest, most desperate winter, a wealthy cattleman newly arrived from the east, named Cornelius Vane, had approached Thorne, then the town's most trusted figure, with a proposition. Vane would fund the church's construction, its bell, its stained glass, its very existence, if Thorne would quietly ensure that the filing of the town plat listed a substantial and fertile stretch of common land, meadow, creek frontage, timber under Vane's name rather than the township's. Thorne, young and proud of what he believed he was building, and perhaps too willing to believe that a small omission in service of a greater good could be forgiven, had agreed. He had falsified the surviving copy of the plat. The true, original survey and a signed statement admitting what he had done, he had hidden here, behind his own altar, unable either to undo the wrong or to live comfortably with having done it, and had left Hollow Creek not for Colorado, as the old-timers assumed, but in a private exile of shame he could not bring himself to explain to the congregation who trusted him. The land in question, Iris came slowly to understand as she grew older and quietly, carefully pieced together the present-day shape of the town against Thorne's old survey, was no longer meadow and creek frontage at all. It was now the very heart of Hollow Creek's remaining prosperity. The grazing commons, the town's smaller ranchers, depended upon each summer land that by rights, by the true original plat, belonged to the township itself to be used by any family who needed it, but which had for 2 decades been quietly fenced, controlled, and leased back to those same families at considerable profit by the descendants of Cornelius Vane. The Vane Ranch, run now by Cornelius's son, Bartholomew Vane, was the largest and most powerful operation in the county, and Bartholomew Vane had inherited not only his father's land, but something of his father's talent for wearing generosity as a public mask over a private appetite for control. Every rancher in Hollow Creek who leased grazing rights from Vane knew, in some unspoken way, that their livelihoods depended on staying in his good graces, and none of them had any reason to imagine that the land they paid him for had never been rightfully his to sell at all. Iris told no one what she knew. She was 16, then 17, then 18, a grown woman now by the reckoning of the frontier, still living in the church that had become, against all early appearance of misfortune, genuinely hers. She had, over the years, repaired its roof, rehung its bell, restored enough of its windows, that on Sunday mornings a small, informal gathering of neighbors had begun once more to meet there, drawn not by any preacher, since Hollow Creek had none, but by Iris herself, who reads scripture aloud in her mother's gentle cadence, and by long habit organized the town's charitable efforts. A basket for the Hendricks family after their barn burned, mended coats each winter for children who had outgrown their own. She had, without ever quite intending to become something like what Elias Thorne himself once was to this town, trusted, steady, the person people turned to, and she understood with clarity that frightened her a little that the ledger hidden behind her altar was not merely a piece of the past. It was a live thing, capable of undoing a powerful man and restoring to an entire town what had quietly been stolen from it, and capable, just as easily, of destroying her, a friendless orphan with no legal standing and no proof beyond an old man's guilty confession, if she moved against Bartholomew Vane carelessly. The drought of 1889 was what finally forced her hand. It came in July, the way the worst droughts always seemed to in that country, creeping in under a sky that would not rain, turning the grazing commons to dust and the smaller ranches of Hollow Creek to quiet desperation. Bartholomew Vane, sensing opportunity the way his father once had, announced that summer that the leasing terms on the commons would rise considerably come autumn, given what he called the increased value of water rights on his land, and that any family unable to pay the new rate would need to sell their cattle at whatever price the market currently offered, which, in a drought year, was no price worth having. Families who had lived in Hollow Creek for 2 generations faced ruin within a single season, and there was nothing under the town's understanding of the law that anyone could do about it, because as far as anyone in Hollow Creek knew, Bartholomew Vane owned that land outright and always had. Iris watched Thomas Hendricks, whose barn she had once helped rebuild, sit on the church steps one evening with his hat in his hands, telling her in a voice gone hollow with worry that he did not know how he would feed his family through the winter if Vane's new rates held and something in her settled, finally, into resolve. She had spent 10 years being careful. She understood now that carefulness alone would not save Hollow Creek, and that Elias Thorne's confession, sealed for 30 years behind an altar no one remembered to look beneath, existed for exactly this moment. She went first not to Vane, whom she did not trust, nor to the sheriff, whom she was not certain would believe her, but to Silas Krebs at the Mercantile, the one man in town who had never once treated her as anything less than capable, and to Judge Amos Whitfield, the circuit judge who rode through Hollow Creek every 2 months to hear what disputes the county could not settle on its own, a man known, unlike many judges of that era, for a genuine and old-fashioned regard for the letter of the law over the comfort of powerful men. She showed them both the ledger and the letter, and watched Judge Whitfield's face change as he read Thorne's confession, watched Krebs go very still beside her. It was not a simple matter, even with such evidence. Bartholomew Vane did not surrender his claim to the commons quietly. He arrived at the courthouse in Hollow Creek with his own lawyer from the county seat, a sharp man in an expensive coat, who argued that a 30-year-old confession from a preacher who had fled town in disgrace proved nothing but the ramblings of a guilty conscience, and that, regardless of any original survey, 3 decades of unchallenged possession settled the matter under any reasonable reading of territorial law. Vane himself, standing in the little Hollow Creek courthouse in his fine gray suit, looked at Iris, the orphan girl he barely remembered existed, who had grown, without his noticing, into a woman the whole town now quietly relied upon with something between amusement and contempt, and suggested to the judge that perhaps this whole matter was simply the invention of a lonely young woman seeking attention she had never properly received. It was Silas Krebs who spoke first in her defense, standing before the judge to say plainly that he had known Iris Calloway since she was a child sweeping out a ruined church for want of anywhere else to go, and that in 10 years he had never once known her to speak an untruth for gain, and that if anyone in that room had a reputation worth doubting, it was not the girl who mended coats each winter for other people's children. Then, one by one, the small ranchers of Hollow Creek, the Hendricks family, the Coopers, old Mrs. Alvarez, whose husband had died breaking sod on land, Vane now claimed stood as well, not because any one of them had proof of their own, but because each of them had, over 10 quiet years, come to trust the steady, capable woman who kept the old church, and their trust, offered publicly and without hesitation, weighed on Judge Whitfield's mind in a way that no lawyer's argument could easily dismiss. He ordered, in the end, a formal review of the original territorial survey records in the capital, a process that would take some months. But he issued, in the meantime, an injunction preventing Vane from raising his leasing rates or evicting any family from the commons until the matter was settled. The survey records, when finally located and compared against Thorne's hidden copy, confirmed every word of the old preacher's confession. The original 1,861 plat, on file where it had lain forgotten for 30 years, showed the meadow and creek frontage as township commons, never legally the property of Cornelius Vane at all. Bartholomew Vane's claim collapsed under the weight of a truth his own father had paid a frightened, well-meaning young preacher to bury, and though Vane kept the considerable ranch land that was legitimately his, the commons, the water, the grazing, the creek frontage that a dying town's whole future had once depended upon, and might yet depend upon, again passed back, at last, into the hands of Hollow Creek itself, to be shared, as Thorne's original vision had intended, among any family who needed it. It was by any measure a quiet justice rather than a dramatic one. Vane faced no prison, paid no great penalty beyond the loss of land he had never rightfully owned, but he faced something perhaps harder for a man of his pride to bear, which was the plain sight of his neighbors, for the first time in 2 generations, no longer needing his permission to survive. Iris did not ask for anything for herself in the settlement, though Judge Whitfield, impressed by both her discovery and her restraint, offered to see that she was compensated for bringing the matter forward. She asked instead that a portion of the recovered commons be set aside, formally and permanently, for the church itself, not as her private property, but as township land held in trust for whatever congregation or community use. Hollow Creek might one day need a small, deliberate echo, though she never said so aloud, of the very promise Elias Thorne had broken and, through her, finally kept. The town, in gratitude neither loud nor showy but lasting, saw to it in the following years that the church roof was properly reshingled at community expense, that its bell was recast when the old one finally cracked, and that the woman who had once been given to a ruined building because no one else would have her was, by unspoken but universal agreement, simply and permanently Hollow Creek's own. It is worth remembering now how this story began. An 8-year-old girl standing alone in a doorway with 11 cents and a carpet bag, turned out by a man who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience given by a town, with no better options to a church, so forgotten that even its own hidden secrets had gone unremembered for 30 years. No one watching that gray October afternoon could have predicted that the dust and cobwebs of that abandoned sanctuary held, sealed, behind its altar, the means by which the very town that had so carelessly discarded her would one day be restored. Iris Calloway never asked to be anyone's savior. She only ever did what her mother and father had taught her without meaning to teach it at all, that a person's worth was not measured by what the world handed them, but by what they were willing, patiently and honestly, to mend. She swept a ruined church because it was the only roof she had, and in sweeping it, in staying faithful to a secret she did not yet understand, she became the very thing Hollow Creek most needed and least expected, proof that what the world throws away is not always worthless, and that sometimes the smallest, most overlooked among us are quietly keeping safe the thing that will one day save everyone else. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Iris Calloway's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that value is not always visible at first glance, and that patience, kept faithfully, has its own quiet power. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real worth in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone, and your stories are what make this small corner of the internet feel like a town worth belonging to. Until next time, stay close.